The woman on the phone said, "Before you hang up, ask him where he buried me." And I have to tell you, at 63 years old, there are not many sentences left in life that can still make your blood turn cold before your mind catches up. I was standing at my kitchen counter with a bowl of pecans I had meant to finish chopping for a church luncheon cake. It was a gray Thursday afternoon in December, and my husband, Walter, was downtown setting up a scholarship dinner he had been talking about for months. The house was quiet in that pleasant way older houses get in winter, all radiator hum and muted windows, and then the phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the line sounded composed, tired, and careful in a way that made me distrust her immediately. She asked if I was a leaner cross. I said yes. Then she said, "My name is June Bennett. Walter told you I was dead. I'm not. And if he's asking you to sign anything, don't." That was the beginning, not the truth, just the beginning. When I married Walter 3 years earlier, I believed I was marrying exactly the kind of man women my age are taught to trust. He was a widower, or so he said. A man who had already suffered enough to value steadiness. A man who knew what loss cost and therefore did not play games with affection. We met through mutual friends at a charity garden tour, of all places, and he carried grief the way some men carry good tailoring, with enough subtlety that people called it dignity. He never used it crudely. That was part of what made it believable. He would mention his late wife only in ways that made him seem thoughtful rather than haunted. He said her name, June, with care, never spectacle. He told me she had died of cancer 15 years earlier, and that for a very long time he believed he would never marry again. He spoke of illness not dramatically, but with the sort of weary tenderness that made me think he had truly sat beside a hospital bed and learned what mattered. At our age, that kind of story lands hard. Not because older women are foolish, but because we have seen enough of life to recognize certain losses and honor them. Or at least we believe we do. I was widowed too, though much more recently when Walter and I met. My husband Paul had died of a stroke at 59, sudden enough to rearrange my world faster than grief could even name what it had taken. By the time I met Walter, I had already spent 6 years learning how to be one woman in a house built for two. I had learned to carry my own groceries, sleep diagonally in the bed, and answer well-meaning invitations without sounding either pathetic or defensive. I had also learned how many people treat widows as though we become a little less visible and a little more available to other people's projections. If we laugh, we're doing so well. If we stay home, we're still not ready. If we date again, everyone becomes a theologian about timing. Walter felt like a relief from all that. He understood the etiquette of survival. He knew how to sit with silence without filling it with advice. He never rushed me. He never flirted like a man trying to prove vitality to himself through someone else's attention. He simply made room. That matters because I want you to understand he didn't fool me by acting grand. He fooled me by acting contained. He was 68 when we married, still handsome in that neat silver-haired way older men sometimes become after they stop fighting time and start using it. He had retired from a regional construction supply business a few years earlier, but still did occasional board work and enough consulting to keep his calendar respectable. He lived modestly but well, knew everybody at church by first name, and had a way of making ordinary acts seem almost ceremonial. Filling the bird feeders. Folding a newspaper, tying a tie. My daughter called him the kind of man who still writes thank you notes, and it was meant as praise. It was praise. I'm not interested in lying now just to make the story simpler. Walter was genuinely pleasant to live with for a long time. He was attentive, disciplined, gentle in public and mostly in private. He fixed things before they broke. He cooked breakfast on Sundays. He noticed when my shoulder hurt before I said a word. That is what made the lie so expensive. It had comfort in it. There were oddities, yes. Looking back, there always are. But none of them arrived with enough force to justify suspicion on their own. He had almost no photographs of June. A few, but not many. He said the rest were boxed in the attic because after her death he couldn't bear seeing them every day. That sounded plausible. He never took me to her grave, though once or twice I suggested maybe I could come with him if he still visited. He always found a reason to delay it. The cemetery was several towns away. The weather was wrong. It was better visited alone. I accepted that too, because grief has private habits, and our generation was raised to respect what older people called a person's way. He also never talked much about June's family. She was an only child, he said. Both parents gone. No siblings, no children. It was one of the things that made his widowhood sound especially sad and complete, a grief without any living infrastructure around it. If he had said she had a sister in Phoenix or a cousin in Ohio, there might have been threads to tug later. But the dead woman in his story was strangely self-contained, sealed off from the world in a way that made her easier to mythologize. I didn't know that then. I only knew I was tired of eating alone. The call on that December afternoon lasted less than 4 minutes. I know because I checked afterward as if the duration might explain the damage. June, the dead woman, the very much not dead woman, did not beg me to believe her. She did something worse for my peace. She sounded certain I eventually would. She said she had seen Walter's photograph in the church bulletin for the scholarship dinner he was launching in his late wife's memory, and that was how she found me. She said she had spent years not looking for him because she was busy surviving the mess he made of her life. And then one Sunday her friend handed her a folded bulletin after service and said, "Either your husband is a miracle or this is a very strange fundraising strategy." June said that line almost dryly, which made it more disturbing than if she had cried. When I asked her what kind of sick joke this was, she answered with something only Walter and I should have known. The make of the old cedar chest in our guest room, the one he claimed had come from June's grandmother, and the one he always treated with particular care. She told me there was a false bottom in it, and that if I lifted the right panel, I would find the original marriage certificate he had never destroyed because Walter can throw away women faster than paperwork. Then she said one more thing before I could stop her. He isn't a widower, Alina. He's a man who prefers dead wives because dead wives can't correct the story. I wish I could tell you I hung up and handled that sentence with calm maturity. I did not. I sat down on the kitchen floor with pecans rolling under the radiator and spent a full minute staring at the baseboard as if the wood grain might tell me which version of my marriage I was living in. Then I went upstairs and opened the cedar chest. There was a false bottom. That detail, more than anything June said, is what convinced me the afternoon had tipped permanently out of ordinary life. Because once one impossible thing becomes tactile, the rest of the lies stop sounding dramatic and start sounding logistical. The panel lifted with embarrassingly little effort. Inside were 3 items: an old county-issued marriage certificate naming Walter Bennett and June Bennett, a faded photograph of the two of them standing in front of a courthouse, and a legal envelope postmarked 19 years earlier containing a notice of attempted service for a divorce action that had never been completed. Never completed. I read that phrase 5 times. Then I looked at the certificate date again. Walter had told me June died 15 years before we met. The marriage certificate was older than that, of course, but the attempted divorce filing was only 19 years old. There was no death certificate, no funeral program, no obituary, just a marriage that had once existed and a divorce that had failed to finish itself. My knees went weak in the least cinematic way possible. Not a collapse, more like the body becoming a bad chair. I did not call Walter. That is the first decision in this story I remain proud of. I could have called. I could have demanded. I could have cried, accused, screamed, begged for explanation, and within 10 minutes I would have been exactly where men like Walter prefer women to be, emotional, ahead of the evidence, and vulnerable to whatever version of order he supplied next. Instead, I did something age finally taught me to do well. I stayed quiet and became deliberate. I called June back. We met 2 days later in a room 40 minutes from my house, one of those places with floral china, heavy curtains, and older women eating chicken salad as if the world outside were not burning. June was 61, broad-shouldered, well-kept, and tired around the eyes in a way that did not read as defeat but endurance. She did not look dead. She did not look theatrical. She looked like a woman who had spent a long time being disbelieved and had learned how to stop asking for anyone's comfort while telling the truth. She also looked, to my horror, exactly like the type of woman Walter would have married. That unnerved me more than I expected. If she had seemed reckless or extravagant or wildly unlike me, I might have been tempted to believe his hidden life belonged to a younger, sloppier, more foolish chapter of himself. But June was ordinary in the deepest possible sense. Intelligent, self-contained, and the kind of woman a man uses as evidence that he respects substance over spectacle. We ordered tea and neither of us touched it for almost half an hour. Her version of Walter was not identical to mine. It was worse. She said he had married her at 35, worked his way slowly into every practical corner of her life, and spent years presenting himself as the steady man compensating for her supposed emotional unreliability. She came from a family that owned a small farm they eventually sold off in parcels, and after both her parents died, she inherited enough land money to become useful without ever becoming truly wealthy. Walter, she said, hated the idea of dependency, but loved the mechanics of access. He never stole all at once. He folded himself into signatures, permissions, advisory conversations, and polite little, let me handle that moments until he was standing between her and most of the decisions that affected her. When she resisted, he did not yell. He explained her, to bank clerks, to relatives, to their pastor, to anyone who might eventually need a version of her more convenient than the real one. That line froze me because it was so precise. He explained her. Then June gave me the part I had not yet imagined. He didn't leave her after some affair or dramatic collapse. He left after she refused to sign over an old family property into a redevelopment arrangement he said would secure their future. She got sick shortly after, not cancer, as he later claimed killed her, but severe pneumonia that became complicated by exhaustion and poor care. And he used that period to move money, reframe her to other people as unstable and difficult, and quietly vanish once he had extracted what he could. By the time she recovered enough to fight, he had changed towns, changed versions of events, and begun living under a story where he was freer than he had any right to be. "Why didn't you find him sooner?" I asked her, though the question sounded ugly the moment it left my mouth. She didn't flinch. "Because I spent years trying to become someone who didn't need the answer anymore," she said. "And because men like Walter always count on women being too humiliated to compare notes." That sentence became the spine of everything that followed. I asked her the question that had been growing darker in me since the cedar chest. "Did he know you were still legally married?" June gave me a look so flat it almost hurt. "He knew better than anyone," she said. "He is the one who made sure the divorce never finished. He liked being able to narrate me as dead more than he wanted the paperwork tidy." That was the moment the story shifted from betrayal to structure. Because if Walter had simply lied about a dead wife to make himself sound sympathetic, that would have been ugly enough. But a man who knows his first marriage still exists and still marries again anyway is not improvising a sad backstory. He is building a mechanism. The question became, for what? I got that answer more slowly than I wanted, and faster than Walter deserved. Over the next week, June and I compared documents, dates, addresses, old utility records, fragments of tax returns, church bulletins, a clipping from a local paper where Walter had been quoted 3 years before, smiling beside me at a community fundraiser and calling himself a widower lucky enough to have found unexpected love later in life. June slid that clipping across the table and said, "That line was almost word for word what he used in town after he left me." Only back then, it was grief support breakfasts instead of scholarship dinners. Scholarship dinners. That was when she asked the question neither of us had wanted to ask yet. What is the scholarship actually for? I had no answer. Walter had spent months organizing a memorial scholarship in June's honor through our church community outreach board. He said he wanted to create a fund for older women restarting life after loss, because that was what June would have wanted if she had lived. I remember being moved by that. Deeply moved, if I'm honest. I helped address donor letters. I wrote personal notes. I called 3 friends to attend the dinner. I donated $5,000 from an account my mother left me. At the time, it felt like love, or at least like the sort of decent stewardship mature marriages are supposed to make possible. Now I sat in a tear room across from the allegedly dead woman the scholarship was supposedly honoring and realized I had probably helped finance my own humiliation. The paperwork answer came from my lawyer. Her name was Patricia Halloway, 70 if she was a day, white hair like steel wool, and the temperament of someone who no longer allows younger people's moral confusion to waste her billable hours. I told her everything, not breathlessly, not elegantly either, just fully. She listened, took notes, and asked practical questions I had not yet had the mind to ask myself. Had Walter ever asked me to move property into joint title? Yes. Had he encouraged me to update beneficiary structures for simplicity? Yes. Had he used the scholarship fund or memorial narrative in any broader planning around estate reputation, donor visibility, or tax-advantage transfers? Possibly. Had we filed a marriage certificate in this county? Yes, though Patricia's face tightened at that. Had I signed anything recently connected to charitable structuring? Yes, but I didn't yet know whether it implicated more than the donation. 3 days later, Patricia called me with the answer. The scholarship wasn't just sentiment, it was a bridge. Walter had been working with a local development group to create a donor-advised charitable structure tied to a future real estate project. That project sat on a parcel adjacent to a former women's residence the church had once owned. My donation and several others were not enormous, but they created legitimacy, seed money, and social optics. More importantly, Walter had also been encouraging me very gently, very respectfully over months to consider donating or partially pledging the small lake cottage my first husband and I had once bought in our 40s. For tax reasons later, Alina, as a legacy choice, only if it feels meaningful. I had not agreed, not yet, but he had clearly intended to keep moving. That was the payoff he wanted, not just my money, my moral endorsement. He wanted me standing in a room full of older church donors, local professionals, and newspaper people, smiling beneath the name of a dead wife who was alive, while he converted grief, charity, respectability, and my widowed caution into one final public trust exercise. He wasn't just lying. He was laundering himself through sympathy. I sat in Patricia's office and felt something in me go from hurt to clean, cold purpose. I want him to lose the room, I said. Patricia looked at me over her glasses and nodded once. Good, she said, because that's where he's been living. The dinner was scheduled for the following Friday. For 8 days, I did not let Walter see a single crack in me. That was harder than people think, not because I still loved him in any meaningful way by then, because performance takes energy, and older women are often exhausted long before anyone credits the amount of acting expected of us. I made breakfast. I reviewed seating lists. I nodded when he practiced his remarks aloud in the den. I helped choose the navy tie that read best under warm light. I listened while he spoke tenderly about June's memory, as if he were a man carrying honorable grief instead of administrative deceit. Once, while folding napkins from the caterer's box, I asked lightly whether he thought June would have liked the menu. He smiled and said, "I think she would have appreciated the gesture." That sentence almost made me laugh in his face. The room he had built for himself was exactly the kind of room older audiences understand instinctively. Holiday decorations tastefully restrained, circular tables, soft gold light, a church fellowship hall dressed up enough to feel civic, quiet donors, people who knew one another's families, people who had sent casseroles when parents died and who still wrote checks by hand. Walter moved through them like a well-maintained heirloom, steady handshake, sad smile, measured gratitude. He introduced me repeatedly as my wife, Alina, who understood what this meant to me from the very beginning. That line played beautifully. It made me look loyal, him look deep, and June look safely dead. He had no idea she was in the building. We had arranged it carefully. Patricia insisted on sequence. June would not walk in early and let the night become gossip in the lobby. No, Walter would get almost all the way to the public climax he wanted. He would feel the room under him. He would speak in June's name. Then he would lose it. The first part of the evening went exactly as he expected. Donations announced. Smiles. Murmured praise. My daughter, who had flown in after I finally told her enough to justify panic, sat 3 tables back looking like someone trying not to set the wallpaper on fire. Patricia was near the side aisle. June waited with her in the vestry room behind the stage, where women had once stored choir robes and funeral flowers. Walter spoke beautifully. I won't lie about that either. Men like him often do. He talked about loss, second chances, the quiet dignity of women who rebuild after widowhood, the sacred duty of community to meet grief with action. He spoke of June as the first great love of my life, and of me as the grace God sent afterward. Several people dabbed their eyes. One of the board members clasped his hands as if he were hearing testimony, not fiction. Then Walter invited me up to say a few words. I walked to the podium and looked at him standing there in the suit we picked together, in the room he believed he controlled, under the banner printed with June's full name. And I said, before this scholarship is formally dedicated, I think the woman it was named for should hear what's being said about her. Nothing in my life has ever matched the silence that followed that sentence. Walter didn't freeze all at once. First, he looked mildly confused, the way a man looks when he thinks the script has shifted slightly but can still be recovered. Then Patricia stepped into view near the side of the platform. Then June walked out from behind the curtain. No one gasped immediately. That came a second later, rippling through the room in pieces as people realized they were not looking at some symbolic representative, some sister, some cousin, some old friend carrying a memory. They were looking at the dead wife. Alive. In a dark green dress, practical shoes, chin level, and eyes fixed directly on Walter like she had waited long enough. He made a sound I had never heard from him before. Not a word. More like the body discovering it had not been consulted. June didn't rush. That was the power of it. She walked to the podium, took the microphone from my hand only after I nodded, and said, "Good evening. My name is June Bennett. I was married to Walter Bennett. I am not dead, and I did not approve this scholarship." Then she set the microphone down. That was all she needed to say. The room broke exactly the way a room like that breaks, not with yelling, but with visible rearrangement. Faces changing. People leaning away from Walter without meaning to. Donors looking not at us, but at one another, recalculating all the emotion they had already spent. The church board chair stood halfway up, then sat, then stood again. My daughter began crying, not from sadness, but from the kind of righteous relief that comes when a lie finally becomes so public it can never be handed back to the victim as misunderstanding. Patricia moved then, smoothly, like a woman serving papers at the altar of decency itself. She handed Walter an envelope, and then another to the board chair. Notice regarding fraudulent representations attached to donor solicitations, marital status disclosures, and a civil action challenging the validity of our marriage, as well as the use of June's name and story for fundraising purposes. Walter tried once. That's what still fascinates me. Even in that moment, with June standing alive under a banner printed for her memorial, he tried once. He said, "Let me explain." I don't know whether I interrupted him or June did. I only know the answer came from our side and landed cleanly. "No," I said. "You've been explaining us for years." That was the line that ended him in the room. Not legally, not fully, not forever, but socially, morally, spiritually, and in the one place he had spent a decade curating himself. Yes, completely. He left through the side door before dessert was served. The rest moved through the proper ugly channels of real life. Attorneys, filings, statements, church board embarrassment, donor retractions, and the administrative grind by which lies are eventually reduced to annotated exhibits. The marriage was invalidated. The scholarship fund was suspended and restructured under an entirely different name for women's housing support, at June's suggestion, which I thought was more grace than Walter deserved from either of us. My donation was returned. The local paper did not print the full scandal, but it didn't need to. Towns our age don't require full publication. They require one credible fracture in a trusted image, and then the rest travels on casseroles and whispers. As for June and me, no, we did not become instant sisters. Life is not sentimental enough for that. But we became something older and, in its way, stronger, accurate to each other. We met for lunch twice a month for a while, compared years, compared phrases, compared the parts of him that only women ever notice because the world keeps rewarding men for how they sound instead of what they cost. She told me once that what shamed her most wasn't that she had believed him, but that she had let silence isolate her after she finally understood. I told her the worst part for me was realizing how much of my dignity I had loaned to his image without ever meaning to. We laughed more than I expected, not because any of it was funny, because older women who survive the same man often recognize something in each other that feels almost like language recovered after misuse. The payoff people always ask about is whether I regret marrying him. That is not the right question. I regret the time, yes. The public trust, yes. The private foolishness, sometimes. But if you live long enough, you realize regret is often just the mind trying to retroactively bargain with a version of you that couldn't yet see what you can see now. What matters to me is this: he did not get to keep the room. He did not get to turn one woman into a widow in the story, and another into the proof that he had survived her beautifully. He did not get to collect sympathy, money, legal advantage, and moral admiration through a lie so polished that no one thought to ask where the body was. And that matters. More than tears. More than revenge fantasies. More than whether he still wakes up at night hearing June say her own name into that microphone, though I hope he does. There is one image I return to more than any other from that night. Not June walking in, not Walter's face, not even the envelope in Patricia's hand. It's the moment just before I spoke, when I looked out at all those people listening to my husband praise his dead wife and felt, with perfect clarity, that I no longer needed the room to believe me before I acted. That may sound small to younger people. It is. Women over 50 are often trained into preserving peace, preserving appearances, preserving gatherings, preserving the version of things everyone else can still stand to look at. The real revenge was not that I embarrassed Walter. It was that I stopped preserving his comfort before he had even finished using it. If you want another story where a woman waits while someone else smiles too soon, I've left one for you on screen. It begins with a sister who thought the will reading was already going her way, until the lawyer reached the last page. Click that one next.